My book, In Quest of the Historical Adam, seeks to answer two questions. First, what are our biblical commitments concerning the historicity of Adam and Eve? And second, are those biblical commitments compatible with the scientific evidence concerning human origins? I argue that we are committed biblically to a historical Adam and Eve, and that this commitment is fully compatible with the evidence of paleoanthropology and population genetics. Michael Keyes does not address the second of these questions, but limits his critique to my answer to the first question. Since most here today will not have read my book, let me summarize my answer to the first question. Just as Richard Burridge was able to demonstrate on the basis of various family resemblances among ancient biographies that the canonical Gospels most closely resemble the literary genre of ancient biography, so on the basis of various family resemblances among myths, I have sought to show that the primeval history of Genesis 1 to 11, while historical, is also mythical in the folklorist's sense of myth, so that these chapters belong to a literary genre which the prominent Assyriologist Thorkild Jakobsen called Mytho-History. Keyes reiterates what I explain in my book, that the study of myth is a multidisciplinary endeavor involving a welter of different concepts, making a unified definition impossible. Therefore, I make it clear in the book that I am using the word myth in the sense in which folklorists use the word, not as a falsehood or a fantastic tale, but rather as a traditional sacred narrative seeking to explain present realities by anchoring them in the prehistoric past, thus validating a culture's contemporary institutions and values. I identify 8 family resemblances of myth that are exhibited by Genesis 1 to 11. 1. Myths are narratives, whether oral or literary. 2. Myths are traditional stories handed down from generation to generation. 3. Myths are sacred for the society that embraces them. 4. Myths are objects of belief by members of the society that embraces them. 5. Myths are set in a primeval age or another realm. 6. Myths are stories in which deities are important characters. 7. Myths seek to anchor present realities such as the world, mankind, natural phenomena, cultural practices, and the prevailing cult in a primordial time. And 8. Myths exhibit fantastic elements and are not troubled by logical contradiction or incoherence. Especially salient in classifying Genesis 1 to 11 will be number 7, the interest in etiology. This is the very heart of myth, in grounding present realities in the primordial past. The primeval history of Genesis 1 to 11 functions as Israel's foundational myth, laying the basis of Israel's worldview. Keyes disagrees with my genre analysis of Genesis 1 to 11. Unfortunately, he offers no genre analysis of his own of these chapters to justify his assumption that they are straightforward historical writing. That cannot simply be assumed. Each interpreter must articulate and justify his proposed genre classification of these chapters. Only then can we weigh the comparative worth of the interpretations. So I ask, what does Keyes have to offer by way of articulation and justification of his understanding of the genre of Genesis 1 to 11? Pending an answer, let us consider Keyes' 4 criticisms of my proposed genre analysis. Objection 1. The theory is applied to the Old Testament inconsistently. This criticism is patently false for the very simple reason that I do not apply my theory to any other portions of the Old Testament, and therefore it is not applied inconsistently. My focus is on the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and whether other portions of the Old Testament should also be classified as mytho-historical as well is left an open question. Keyes is correct that I note the universal conviction among Old Testament scholars that Genesis 1 to 11 stands apart from the patriarchal narratives which follow as distinct in genre, which serves to justify my focus. In any case, the remedy to this problem, if it were a problem, would be simply to apply the theory consistently to the remainder of the Old Testament and let the chips fall where they may. We might therefore be tempted to dismiss Keyes' first objection as an irrelevance. But I think that there actually is a serious point here which he has misexpressed. His real criticism, I think, is that the application of my family resemblances to Old Testament passages that are indisputably non-mythical would require us to classify such passages as mythical, thereby exposing the inadequacy of the criteria. But is that in fact the case? Keyes thinks that, on my view, the Abrahamic narratives of Genesis 17 and 18 ought to count as mytho-historical. But it is illegitimate to pluck these 2 chapters out of the whole Abraham cycle, as it is called, comprising Genesis 12 to 25. One must try to determine the literary genre of the whole literary unit. The Abraham cycle is not plausibly classified as mytho-history by my criteria because it is not anchored in events of the primeval past, but of relatively recent history. Moreover, the anthropomorphic appearance of the Lord to Abraham in Genesis 18 is plausibly to be regarded as a theophany, a category that I argue in my book is not applicable to the descriptions of God in Genesis 2 and 3. A theophany, being a miracle, is not at all fantastic. What about the stories of the Exodus? Again, I leave the analysis of these narratives an open question for others to pursue. But note once more that these stories are not about the primeval past, but about events within human memory. Folklorists distinguish between myths, legends, and fables. Unlike myths, legends are set in a time that is not so remote. So if the events of the Exodus are not historical, these narratives would be more plausibly classified as legends rather than myths. In Keyes' footnote 48, he cites Laura Felt's book, The Fantastic in Religious Narrative from Exodus to Elisha, who, unlike me, does equate the miraculous with the fantastic. Felt writes, quote, "The Exodus narrative has resisted an easy labeling in terms of myth, legend, or history. On the one hand, it is filled with miracles and other fantastic events. But on the other, it is set in a realistic, everyday-like world and makes reference to places, names, and characters that have a semblance of factual existence in the text external world. That precludes its being classified as myth. Now, Keyes gives no indication of how the patriarchal or Exodus narratives should be classified literarily. His strategy is basically a scare tactic, a slippery slope argument aimed at frightening evangelicals into affirming that the genre of Genesis 1 to 11 is historical writing. Objection 2. The theory uses excessive literalism to argue for the myth trait of fantastic elements. The eighth family resemblance of myths that I list is that myths exhibit fantastic elements, that is to say, elements that are patently false if taken literally. No one who has read the literature of mythology would deny that this family resemblance typifies myths. In the book, I detail a plethora of such fantastic elements in Genesis 1 to 11, including creation in 6 consecutive 24-hour days, the humanoid deity of Genesis 2 and 3, a worldwide flood within human history that wiped out all terrestrial life on Earth, save that aboard Noah's Ark, the origin of all languages at the Tower of Babel, and so on and on. I'm unconvinced by attempts to explain away these elements by contending, for example, that there are vast gaps between the days, that the humanoid deity was actually the pre-incarnate Christ, that only a local flood is described, and that a confusion of only regional languages was involved, and so on. Keyes' strategy is to argue that I am excessively literal about Genesis 1 to 11 in order to exhibit the patent falsehood of certain elements. Now, this is a strange criticism, for it is precisely my contention that these narratives should not be taken literally, and that when we are literal about them, then they become fantastic. So, Keyes and I actually agree that we should not interpret these narratives with a sort of wooden literalism. The question is, why not? The mytho-historical genre analysis answers that question. As I show in the book, myths are not intended to be taken with a wooden literality, but are frequently metaphorical and figurative. When you look at the single example that Keyes has selected for criticism, it is actually he himself who opts for the literal interpretation of the narrative. He thinks that there actually was a talking snake in the garden. And he explains this by importing a supernatural figure like Satan to incarnate the snake. But such an importation is not only without textual warrant, but is actually incompatible with the text when it characterizes the snake as more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. But then when it comes to the snakes being cursed to crawl on its belly as snakes do, and to be at enmity with man, suddenly Keyes backs away from his literalism and opts for a figurative interpretation of the narrative. It appears, to borrow a phrase, that his theory is applied to the passage inconsistently. One cannot isolate this single element of the story, as Keyes does, and try to explain it away while accepting the rest literally, when the whole story is filled with multiple such fantastic elements, such as trees whose fruit magically produces immortality or knowledge of good and evil, and cherubim posted with a rotating, flashing sword at the entrance of the Garden of Eden to keep the couple from re-entering. The whole account is plausibly mytho-historical, not straightforward history. As Henri Blocher once remarked, what we have in Genesis is an account of the historical fall, not a historical account of the fall. Criticism 3. The theory contradicts New Testament texts that depend on Genesis 2 as real history. This is the most important objection to my genre analysis, one that caused me a great deal of worry. It seems to me almost indisputable that Genesis 1 to 11 is quasi-mythical. But what about the New Testament references to these chapters? What helped me to come to peace about this issue is the realization that the New Testament often refers to figures of Jewish folklore and mythology who are not historical. See my book for a detailed discussion of such references. If we are not to find ourselves biblically committed to the historicity of people like Janus and Jambres, or things like the rolling well that followed the Israelites during their wilderness wanderings, then we must take the references to these people and things to be merely literary references, much as I might refer to Robinson Crusoe. What this means is that we are not committed to the historicity of some figure or event simply because it is mentioned in the New Testament. Similarly, the vast majority of New Testament references to Adam and Eve are merely to the literary Adam and Eve, that is to say, to the figures described in Genesis 2 and 3. The principal exception is Romans 5:12, where Paul attributes to Adam's fall causal effects upon the world outside the story world of the narrative. That commits us to a historical Adam. But Key's examples do not take us outside the story world of the text. Just look at his examples. Paul says that Adam was created first and then Eve. That's a description of what happens in the story. Given that the story is inspired by God, its teaching on the man-woman relation is therefore doctrinally obligatory. We agree on that. But contrary to David Garland, whom Keyes quotes, there's nothing here that requires the historicity of Adam and Eve. Moreover, Keyes' quotation from Gordon Fee actually supports my position. Fee said, Paul's point, of course, is that in the creation narrative, this did not happen the other way around, man from woman for her sake. In the creation narrative, this no more requires historicity than saying that in Daniel Defoe's novel, Robinson Crusoe lived alone for many years on an island. Keyes' so-called historical narrative explanation assumes that we are dealing with a historical narrative, which is question-begging. You can give a narrative explanation of other events in the narrative without requiring historicity. For example, why the dog in the Sherlock Holmes story did not bark. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not denying that these New Testament references are historically accurate. I'm simply saying that such references do not serve as positive proofs of historicity. To have a positive proof of historicity, you need to have some way of getting outside the story world. For example, a causal effect of something in the story on the real world outside the story world, just as we do in Romans 5:12. So when Keyes says that Jesus referred to the actual Adam-Eve creation sequence as reported in Genesis 2, not just to a mere literary fiction, he is multiply confused. Referring to a narrative sequence as reported in Genesis 2 does not get us outside of the story world. And reference to something inside the story world is not mere literary fiction, but rather reference to a literary character who may or may not be historical. None of the examples that Keyes provides suffices to prove that we are committed to the historicity of the things narrated. And a good thing, too, lest we find ourselves committed to the historicity of the figures and events of Jewish folklore and mythology. Criticism 4. The theory's description of myth is highly contested. Keyes quotes Paul Cho to show that the study of myth occurs in a multiplicity of disciplines, resulting in the multiplication of definitions. As a result, no single definition is likely to gain universal assent. This is a point which I myself made on pages 35 to 37 of In Quest of the Historical Adam. I cite biblical scholar J.W. Rogerson, who says tongue-in-cheek that today the range of the meaning of the word myth is so broad that the word can hardly be wrongly used. To illustrate the point, I recall attending a session on myth at the SBL in San Antonio, hoping to acquire some fresh insight. Instead, what I found was that the scholars involved had such a nebulous conception of myth that, according to one panelist, a statue or even a photograph can count as a myth. Such a conception is worthless in the classification of literature, and that is why I explicitly adopted the characterization of myth preferred by classicists and folklorists. Several of the family resemblances of myth that I identified, despite being very general, are important in excluding such things as statues, photographs, Elvis, Star Trek, and the self-made man from being classified as myths. Therefore, Keyes' survey of 200 books spanning different disciplines and using the word myth in diverse ways is worthless. I agree with Catherine Belsey, whom he quotes, that myths are attempts to make sense of the world. Myths are not just for entertainment, but stories of the origins of things. For the culture that subscribes to them, they have explanatory power. Exactly right. Stories for entertainment are called fables by folklorists, in contrast to myths and legends. As Belsey says, myths are stories of the origins of things that have explanatory power for the culture that subscribes to them. That does not even begin to address the question of whether myths are to be understood literally by members of that culture. Since I devote an entire chapter to that question, chock full of examples, Keyes owes us some interaction with the contents of that chapter. Keyes says that almost all of the authors of the 88 books who do use myth in the folklorist sense think that the myths they study are largely false, even though they do not say so for reasons of professional etiquette. I'm tempted to ask when Keyes acquired this mind-reading ability. But never mind. His statement is true only in the sense that these scholars think that the myths are largely false if taken literally. But it's precisely the point that myths are not intended to be read literally, and therefore many express important truths. Moreover, keep in mind that I'm not talking about pure myth, but about mytho-istory, a literary genre that blends both history and myth. At the end of the day, Keyes' criticisms come up terribly short. He does not tell us what myth is, or why folklorists are mistaken in their understanding of myth, or what the actual characteristics of myth are. More importantly, he does nothing to justify his assumption that the literary genre of Genesis 1 to 11 is straightforward history. Finally, he does not even address the question of how a literal interpretation of these chapters would be consistent with the evidence of contemporary history, science, and linguistics, or how to deal with the dislocations in the doctrine of biblical inspiration that would inevitably arise as a result of such a conflict.